Hey, how are ya?
I'm good. How are you? Hey,
Doing good?
y'all. Welcome to Brave Space Live. I'm Tychelle. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have to read that every single time because I forget the title. I'm a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner and learning
It
consultant.
is a
And
bit of a
this,
mouthful. I don't blame you.
I mean, it's not as bad as a social. What's your title
Social
again? Ethicist.
ethicist. No one can say it, including myself. I'm also an author. There we go. We got it
Oh,
out.
she's an author.
I'm an
I
author.
I bought her book. I have it.
You
So just so you know,
did.
I
That
did.
meant so
I
much
did.
to me. That was when we barely knew each other, and you're like, "I'm
I
gonna buy your
know.
book," and I was like, "Okay,
I
thank
did. And
you.
one of my friends just wrote a children's book, and I bought that too on Amazon.
You're
So
so supportive. What a good friend
I
you are."
try, especially when it's under $20. I'm really
Yeah.
supportive. So, hey, we're in this conversation already. So before we go too far into that conversation, welcome back. So today we'll be talking about the kind of the co-opting of Dr. Martin Luther King and what that looks like in today's, I guess, lexicon, and how that conversation has been happening, especially in places where we see a lot of activism, which I guess social media is one of those places. We have to add social media activism as a part of that, and we hear Dr. King come up a lot. So I know, Mel, you were going to tell us a little bit of a story about something you learned while you were in school about Dr. King, I guess.
Yeah, so I was taking a class on Black spirituality in the US from a wonderful queer feminist Black theologian named Dr. Pamela Lidesey. And one of the first things we talked about in the class is how Black people, according to her, don't talk about MLK. They talk about Dr. King. Is that your experience, Tychelle?
I would say, I mean, I grew up near MLK Boulevard, so I think it's a little bit different, but
Yeah.
definitely when I'm referencing him, I try to give him his full credence and name and not just calling him by an acronym.
Yeah, a lot of white people I hear say MLK. It's very rare for me to hear white people say Dr. King, and I had never thought about that before. It was very interesting to me to think, even in the way we refer to this person, kind of shows some underlying assumptions and possibly beliefs about his legacy. So this is going to be an awesome conversation. I'm really
I think
looking
it's
forward to it.
so even off of, shooting off of that, one of the things I think is interesting is you can kind of say that MLK and Dr. King are two different people to two different groups of people,
Ah, that's
right? So
insightful.
like
Yeah,
MLK is not necessarily Dr. Martin Luther King and his legacy. MLK is what people have made him now, I would say.
yeah, he's like the Disneyland version.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's bad. They
yeah,
can't.
right.
So
Well, actually, I found a political cartoon that like embodies this
yeah.
perfectly. Let me show it here.
Oh,
So
awesome.
I'm going
Can
to
you
read it
read
for
it?
you if you can't see this, anyone who's watching. So over here on the left-hand side of the screen, we have Dr. King, 1967, saying, "There are literally two Americas. One America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity, but there is another America. In this America, people are poor by the millions. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity." And then over on the right side of the screen, there's a white couple, and the guy saying to the woman, "I prefer the guy who talks about dreams and stuff."
It does like completely summarize this
It
conversation. And
hits, right? That
yeah,
hits.
it
Like white
does.
folks really like to think about MLK, but not Dr. King and everything he fought for, including economic justice was a big part of what he talked about. So we're going to get into that today.
You know what? Well, you know what image came to my mind, and this is my own an image that popped into my head, so not like an actual image out there. It's kind of like whittling a tree down to a toothpick. Like I
Hmm.
think that's kind of what I hear when people talk about the only time they talk about MLK, the two things, or Dr. Martin Luther King, the two things that they usually say are the I Have a Dream speech, content of the character, not color of your skin.
Mm-hmm.
And then they talk about nonviolence. Those are the only two ways he usually
Yeah.
comes up for people, not some of the other things. So I'm
And
going to
there
start
and
off. Go
people
ahead.
usually talk about the nonviolence when there's like property destruction and they are opposing like leftist progress,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's like used as a weapon, kind of. Anyway,
It is, and that's kind of,
yeah.
I mean, that's kind of where I wanted to start it. Just this whole thought process of like romanticizing the civil rights era. So I kind of wanted to start with when we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. specifically, because his
Junior.
father and his son, there's a senior, junior, and a third. And one of the things that comes up a lot is when we talk about civil rights, we kind of romanticize it as this time gone by, this thing that happened, this era where things were bad and they're no longer bad, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's so how the story usually goes is like there was racism, there was slavery, and then after slavery there was racism, and then Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther, well, people would say MLK, did a speech on
Yep.
Washington, and then racism,
It was
the
magic.
end, the end.
Disneyland. Yeah,
Yeah. That,
exactly.
so that's our whole conversation today. No, I'm just joking.
Goodbye.
But
Thanks for listening.
thanks. But that's kind of what happens. People tend to romanticize the
Mm-hmm.
civil rights era. And the other thing that I was thinking of when we talk about civil rights, often we talk about when you look up civil rights era photos, they're often in black and white,
Yep.
which kind of gives you the notion that they were hundreds of years ago. But
Mm-hmm.
really, like the year that the Civil Rights Act passed, that was the year my mother was born. So
They
it's
had
not
colorful photography. They had
they
options for
right, they did, but
Technicolor.
they just didn't show it because it makes it seem as if it was so long ago.
Right.
And just this thought that like that's where racism ended, and you know, you hear kind of that thought process. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King's his I Have a Dream speech, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
one. That's the famous one. I want my children to be known for for not for the color of their skin, but the content of their character, so they can play with little white boys and little black boys can play together, right? Like that's the speech.
Yeah.
We don't not all of the other speeches, not all of the other ideology that he put behind it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things I thought would be interesting to talk about is Martin Luther King was chosen. And I say that not
Mm.
in like just a chosen by God. I don't know him and God's conversation, the ones that they're probably having
Could
right
have
now,
been.
whatever.
We don't know.
But I say he's chosen much like AOC was chosen, much like and this goes into a little bit of political sphere, much like Barack Obama was chosen. And I say that because I want people to know that there were people behind Martin Luther King. Some would say more radical than Martin Luther King, but they chose him. They chose him because he was a 15-year-old high school graduate going into Morehouse College. He was a Christian. He
Hold on.
was,
Sorry to interrupt. He was 15? Hold
yeah, he's
on.
about 15 or 16 when he started college, I believe. Somebody, I'm gonna have to fact.
Wow. But
I'm gonna have to fact check myself, but I believe he was about 15 or
but not
16.
when he started being a figurehead for the civil rights movement.
No.
But when
That's
he
not
started college.
when he started
Gotcha.
college.
Thank you.
So
So
he
he was young
started.
for his
He was
grade.
really young, really smart. He
Mm.
was a Baptist Christian. He was brought up in the church. He was a preacher.
Yep.
So they chose him because he was unscathed. He
Hmm.
was not. He was easy to engage with. He got all the Christians on board. So if you were a Christian in your, you could relate to him. He was smart, so you couldn't call him like dumb. You couldn't call him a vagrant, like things like that. So they chose him as a
Hmm.
figurehead. Much like, and people don't know this either. They chose. Well, she chose because she was working herself, but Rosa Parks did what she did not just because she was having the day that she had and she didn't want to move, that was part of it, but because Claudette Colvin a few months before was a black 15-year-old pregnant girl who did the same thing and was arrested. So they chose an older woman who was working with the SCLC or SNCC is the two groups, They that worked so that they had a person that was respectable, and that because that's leading into like the respectability politics,
Yeah, we
that we'll
talked about
talk
that
about a
last
little bit.
episode.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so they chose these people to be shown or to be those figureheads because they were unscathed, they were neat, they were sanitary, right?
Mm.
And that's this it goes into this thought process that for people of color to be, or for black people specifically to be, in the public eye, we have to be completely devoid of any scandal, any problems. And I'm not
Humanity.
right, like we have to
Yeah.
be perfect to be
Hmm.
equal, right? So when people say Obama was a great speaker, he was Harvard, he was married to this one woman, unlike many other presidents. Some, I'm not going to say their names, but he was, a lawyer. He was a community man. I'm not even going to say he was a great president. That's, I mean, that's up for debate. But he was unscandaled, right? And
Yeah.
they were chosen in the same way, right? So
Yeah.
this is how they link those two histories. um, Martin walked or marched so that Barack could run is kind of the part of the slogan that came out in 2008. So I thought that was interesting to share on just that part of it. So I'd love
Yeah.
to hear some of your thoughts on like this whitewashing of, or this romanticizing of the civil rights era.
Gosh, I have so many thoughts. So we talked about this when we were planning this show because we had an earlier episode about civility and how civility is often weaponized to keep people of color in quote unquote their place, right?
Yep.
To say that you only, and I think this really ties back into what you were saying, Taisha, like this pressure to earn equality, to earn respect,
Yeah.
to be guilty until proven to be innocent. Sorry, guilty until proven innocent. Like you have
The
to
opposite.
prove yourself constantly. And
Yep.
I think civility really functions that way to like force people into these little boxes that you have to comply with and fit in with before you will earn respect that should be granted to you just by basis of being a human. um and we were talking about I mean, I was thinking about selective memory, how
Sure.
we select, white people in particular really like to pick and choose what memories we celebrate of Dr. King, and honestly get like social cookies for those happy I have a dream memories while not being held accountable for ignoring all the other stuff. Like I remember when the Floyd protests happened last summer, right? And we'll probably talk about that quite a bit this episode. Um, you know, bless their hearts, I guess, but I have, white conservative and moderate friends, and and I'll put myself in this bucket to an extent. I have a lot of privilege. I have some, I come out of that world, so I'm not trying to point fingers without pointing some at myself, but you know, people posting Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King Jr. quotes on Facebook or whatever, and getting applause for being, not racist because they posted this stuff. Um, so, like, reaping the benefits of that attention and those accolades from other white people because you stand with Dr. King, but not really doing anything real with that information and ignoring all the other stuff, ignoring calls for economic inequality or adjusting police brutality, addressing police brutality and stuff like that. So, yeah, selective memory, I guess, is the phrase that came to mind most during the planning of this episode.
So yeah, so one of those things that kind of really harkens back for me is this thought that, and I think when people use Dr. King's words, what they're often doing is watering it down to just one thing. That whittling down to that one toothpick for that one use, when there's a
Hmm.
whole tree full of things that you could learn about the things that he said. And I think, it's often chosen the I have a dream speech because it mentions white people, right? Like the mention of white people in a positive light is
Oh, yeah,
there,
white people
right?
really like that.
Oh my God, they
We
love it. They're like
really like attention.
salivating over not by the color of my skin, but the content of my character. I've heard people say that
Oh, heck yeah.
weaponized against other people, and they're like, "What do you
Mm.
mean? You're if you're talking about my skin color, then you're racist." And it's like, girl, like, okay,
Way to
so
run
it's just
straight into the point and still miss it.
exactly like just like it smacked you in the face, and you're like, nope, I don't, nope, I can't. And it is, and it's one of those things that like I just he stood out there, and I say that when we were talking about this as well, when we were talking about Dr. King and why he was chosen, nonviolence, his tactic in his marching, in his protest, his tactic for protest was chosen. He chose it methodically, right? And he chose it because he was a member of clergy. He was a church going man, a Christian, and that he knew if when they had gotten beaten up by the police, dogs sicked on them, when and you can watch this if you've not watched Selma, please, with David Oyelowo, please go watch it. The song "Glory" makes me cry every time I hear it. With John Legend and Common, it is a beautiful song. There's so many people in that movie. When you watch it, dogs being sicked on, and so many of the people in this in the march, in the fight for justice and civil rights were like 19, 20, 21, that kind of age. So when they're fighting and they're doing all of these things, and it started to be televised because it wasn't that long ago, so it's not like before TVs existed. He chose nonviolence as a tactic because he was a clergyman, because he used a lot of church members with SNCC, and I can't, and I have to look up the I know SNCC, but I can't remember the name off the top of my head, what the acronym stands for. And SCLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, something like that. He chose it because when they were getting beaten and they were engaged and they were marching and things like that, he knew that people were going to be watching, and it was his call to other clergy members, Christian, Muslim, specifically really priestly people, white people, who, as they marched through the streets and things were being thrown at them, and hoses were being turned on them and dogs were being sicked on them, that people couldn't ignore it because they were watching people non-violently engaging, right? That's the
Mhm.
reason that they chose it. That's the
Yeah.
reason. That's the reason, the tactic that they chose. But he also then said something like, and I think we have a quote about the riots are the language of the unheard.
Yeah, I want to get into that in a minute, but
Absolutely.
yeah,
Go ahead.
so this
Respond to
idea
that.
of nonviolent resistance is so interesting. Um, so the way it was taught to me is that um, coming out of this idea, there's a Bible verse in Romans that says, "If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head." And this idea from like a theological perspective, I'm a seminary graduate, so of course I'm going to talk about this because I went to Dr. King's alma mater. I graduated from Boston University also, so there's a really cool legacy of Dr. King's work there, was an amazing place to study. So there's an idea that that great kindness and great love overcomes evil, which sounds like a comic book until, like you said, Tychelle, you put it in real life and you see the sacrifice, the bodily autonomy, the safety, the time, the energy, the
Mm-hmm.
resource, the mental health sacrifice that goes into how much it takes to overcome evil with love. Like, that is not at all a romantic picture. So I think the way it was taught to me is the idea was that the to be so kind and so respectable and so upstanding that if your enemy does anything to hurt you, they expose their own shame,
Yep. Yep.
right? And this goes back to our conversation with Rebecca Larson about the shame of white supremacy and like the fact that white America really hasn't faced it. So when it is exposed, or rather when it exposes itself by rearing its ugly head and then it gets televised, it just makes people look foolish and cruel. So it was really not only courageous, but it seemed like very much a risk that these organizers took in using it as a tactic, anticipating that these racist white people would expose themselves, right?
Right.
Like, would make themselves look foolish in the face of patience and love and whatnot. But the sacrifice that involved is just immense. Yeah.
It is, and it's really interesting to me, and I would actually maybe not necessarily use the term love, because some of it, not everybody who marched with Dr. King was like, I love America, I love, but they wanted rights, and they knew that if they
Right.
didn't, if they, because it wasn't just about loving your enemy through the racism, through the experience. It was also about the tactic being used is that if we got violent, we're giving them a reason to kill us,
Yeah.
right? And when you if you turn on your TV and you're at home with your family and you see us walking down the street and you see people throwing things at us, turning hoses on us, beating us with billy clubs, it's going to compel you, right? But if you see us fighting back, you have a cause to say, well, they were fighting back, I'm going to turn off the TV. Much like we see in, well, they were burning down buildings, so they should get killed by the police. I don't know, like how people even equate them, but they do. Well,
Yeah.
because you hear people say that constantly, like, well, they shouldn't be burning down cities, right? They
Yeah.
shouldn't be burning down buildings, as if buildings are as important as people. And
Yes.
one of the, before we go, kind of transition a little bit in talking about riots, one of the things that it brings up for me in thinking about like Colin Kaepernick, right? That was a specifically peaceful protest, but it was a nuisance to people.
Oh, it made people so mad. I've never seen white people that mad about anything than a black man just choosing to kneel. That's all he's been doing, and people freaked out.
I will say I recently had a conversation with somebody about someone was bringing up, Trump flags and things like that. And I was presenting to a group, and this group was saying, when I go into a neighborhood and I see Trump flags, like, I don't feel welcome. We're talking about like microaggressions, and I said some black people feel that way about the American flag, and this one woman was like, I what? And I was like,
Mm.
well, I'm not saying that we want to feel that way,
Mm-mm.
but if I walk into a neighborhood, I'm only gonna speak for me and a lot of us, but me, and say, if I walk into a neighborhood and every house has an American flag, I'm like, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. I don't think I feel safe here. I don't think I want to be here. And I don't
Yeah.
want to feel like that under this flag. Right. I'm also not a
Interesting.
person who, like, I stopped pledging allegiance to the flag in second grade because it just was like felt a little indoctrinating. But I still believe in the ideals, and want to believe in the ideals of America. But am I, and I say that having a father who was a veteran, a grandfather who was a veteran, other people in my family who are veterans as well. My grandfather, when he was buried with an American flag because he was a veteran. But my father also left the army because he had a commanding officer that treated him poorly because he was black.
Hmm.
So, but one of those things is that, just thinking about what it means, and what is conveyed when people share certain things. So I think about that. People felt like, and he, Colin Kaepernick went to a veteran, and instead of sitting out, he knelt. And it's like, okay,
Yeah,
but
he
that was
he
a
got the
peaceful
advice to do that from a veteran. From like, I
right.
think a Purple Heart veteran was like, "Well,
Right,
why don't
because
you?"
that's when they would kneel in sorrow
Yeah.
at grave sites. So
Yeah.
that's why he had that conversation. But it was a nuisance to people, even though it was. So it's like, if you don't want us to kneel, how else should we protest? And it's like,
Right.
quietly, so I don't have to hear it unless I want to.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And I think about that, and how that, what that shows to us now. Like, okay, so if I did what Martin did, would we still have that same result? Also, forgetting some of the other legacy of him, but I know we were going to talk a little
So,
bit about
well, I want to go
misquoting
back
him
to
and
this.
stuff.
I'm really
Go
glad you
ahead.
said that thing about love, because I want to clarify, and I'm so glad you said that. I want to clarify that I don't think it should be anyone's expectation to like love people who are trying to kill you. I mean, unless that's your like religious conviction, but I don't think it's my place or anyone's place to tell you, if you're a person of color, you have to love racists and show them love. I think the idea is more like to be an embodiment of love and the way that humans ought
Mm-hmm.
to treat each other, to model that, to show that, right? Would you agree with that more? That's probably a
I,
better explanation of it.
yes, I do, because I mean, there are people out there who want to love white people out of racism, and I mean, it's not as if I don't embody that when I have white friends and things like that, but it's not my job, right? It's not the job of. But there, I mean, there's he's a musician who, his name's David somebody, but he goes around and he, has gotten KKK members to like denounce the KKK, leave the
Yeah.
KKK, because he has conversations with them and loves them and all of that. That's his ministry. That's not my ministry. Like, I'm
Yeah.
not about to spend my life having those. He also has the luxury of being able to do those things, whereas he's his own boss and things like that. So he's not going to work and somebody else telling him what to do, right?
Yeah.
Just different things like that. So I think it's an interesting. It's hard, but I do think, I mean, I love people in general. I'm not saying that you shouldn't love people, but it can't be somebody's job. But I think being the embodiment of who you want to be. But I think that when people use love, often for Dr. Martin Luther King's, I'm gonna shorten it and call him Dr. King, for Dr. King's vision, it's like absolve. When they say love, they want you to absolve them of any wrongdoing they even feel.
Yes. Yes.
That's
Exactly.
that's
Just
the way
forgive
that they
me.
show love.
Yeah, let's just reconcile and forgive each
Right.
other, and it'll be fine.
And not
Racism is
even
magically
not
fixed.
and I would say even past forgiveness. Don't even look at anything that I've done wrong. You don't even have to forgive me because I've done nothing wrong, because
Oh,
I love you, you love me, and we're the same, in a very
yeah.
Barney sort of way, which is kind of ridiculous. And that's what came, that of course that came to my mind. But that is
Yeah.
it's a ridiculous notion.
Well, so I mean, this going back to Dr. King though, this is so interesting because even if you have like a quote unquote perfect movement, right? You try to embody love, you try to be a model citizen, you try to do nothing wrong, you try to be nonviolent, you try to stage sit-ins instead of punch people in the face, right? You try to take the knee instead of stabbing, right? This is what happens. So in Dr.
Right.
King's day, he was thoroughly hated even by self-proclaimed progressive white people. This is
Mm-hmm.
a really interesting story that I found. So there's a cartoonist, political cartoonist named Charles Brooks, who had to at one point have an FBI security detail because he was making fun of KKK members in his political cartoons. So dude was ballsy as far as like trying to take on the overt racists.
Mm.
Then he decided to attack Dr. King, and I'm showing a political cartoon here. So it's Dr. King talking to a reporter, and surrounding him is just vehicles on fire, buildings on fire. There's a man laying down in the street unconscious. Everything's broken. There's bricks in the street. Talking to a reporter, and then the caption is, "I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow." Dr. King is saying. Now this is where it gets really interesting because after Dr. King's death, they found this particular cartoon that had been written on by Charles Brooks, the cartoonist. So if you can see the video
Mm.
right now, all of the handwriting on top of this cartoon is from the cartoonist himself. So he wrote to Dr. King, and this is what he wrote to him. "How can you, a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, be such a deceitful hypocrite? You're not fooling anyone but yourself in your illegible, nauseating talk about nonviolence, and then you demand a program to overcome poverty and untold amounts of high living all over the globe to feed your own egoism." So Dr. King was completely attacked, even by white people who should have supported his cause, because his nonviolence, uh, you know, there was after there were consequences of the nonviolence that were unintended, right?
Right.
And then he was blamed for that, and then called an egomaniac, and so it's like, who this guy can't win.
Right.
There's no reality where he's gonna make white America happy with him for speaking the truth.
It's interesting because when we talk about romanticizing the civil rights, or even romanticizing Dr. King, we can do that in the 2000s, even the 90s, because we don't live in the times that he lived in, even though some of our parents and many of our grandparents did, right? He was followed and traced by the FBI,
Yep.
called the enemy by, I think, Hoover, or whoever, at J. Edgar Hoover, when he was running the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
He was jailed. This is how we get letters from a Birmingham jail. And he was ultimately assassinated. And
Mm-hmm.
there's speculation that it was not necessarily by just some rogue racist, that it was actually the government planting that person.
I think
Right.
his widow said that for until
Right.
she
So that
died,
has
right?
been
Coretta.
that has been some
Yeah.
speculation that's been out there for quite some time. So when we talk about Martin Luther King or Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. King's legacy, we can't just be talking about how he made this one speech on Washington. He went to a hotel, some rogue racist killed him, and the end racism is over,
Yeah.
because he had things that happened after that. But he was detailed by the FBI.
Right. He was
He
on a
was
hit list.
jailed. He
Yeah.
was right. So we're not we people want to leave out all of those other things and just go straight to this one speech, right? So it's so nauseating to, and I'm going to use that word that the cartoonists use. It's so nauseating to people of color and activists, black people and activists, when we hear his words being co-opted or used as a weapon now against us or
Mm.
against people who want more than just to play with white boys and girls, right?
Yeah.
For people to play together. So I think it's man, it's that selective memory that you talk of.
Selective memory. Yeah. And one of the biggest things that's been erased from the way we teach Dr. King is his calls for economic justice, because he understood before we had the term systemic racism, before we had the term intersectionality, he understood that we're never going to end racism in this country until we end poverty. Like the two are totally linked. And he talked about poverty and economic justice all the time. In fact, I've got some quotes if you want to, maybe you want to read this one, Tychelle.
Sure. I can't read the top. I see the. Can you read the first line for me?
We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing oriented society.
To a person oriented society, when machines and computers profit, motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triples or racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. Right? So, really looking at all three, materialism and racism, and the overly militarized.
Took on the military industrial complex before we had that term, before we had, he understood how interlinked our
Right.
society is, and that racism is not just, is not just people saying slurs. It really lives in these systems of our
Right.
society, and it
Right.
lives in the values that we hold as a people. And we need a revolution of values as much as we need a revolution of, just not saying certain words or changing laws. So
So I think it's so interesting too, because one of the things that we have to talk about is we have to talk about wealth inequality, because he talked about that as well,
yeah.
right? So he talked often about the wealth, the racial wealth gap, and
Yep.
being and how we need to, because if I mean, I guess he would be considered a socialist in today's, because he talked about wealth redistribution,
Hmm.
right, which people did not love, and
Yeah.
giving to the poor and redistributing wealth. And it's so funny, I was actually just looking at a study the other day and talking about how people see our racial wealth stratification as like the top 40% have money, when it's really like this top 1% have all of this money, and they see it, we think it's more distributed than it is, and it isn't. And then
No.
how we want it to be is also very different from how it actually is, in that the bottom, I think 40% have like almost none of the wealth. So he was for wealth redistribution. So when people talk about Martin Luther King, I'm like, okay, but you like that speech, but what about that wealth redistribution he was talking about, girl? Okay, girl.
Yeah. And now we're 60 years after, his death, his assassination. Um, and our wealth inequality is worse than it was
Worse,
during his time.
worse, worse,
There was a
absolutely
study
worse.
done in Boston a couple of years ago that just sent shockwaves throughout a lot of activist communities that work on economic justice. So the study uh, looked at the average. I can pull it up actually here. I've got the chart. So they looked at the net worth of households in Greater Boston. The average white family, the average white household in the Boston area, had about $250,000 of net worth. We're talking, IRA, like Roth IRA accounts, retirement. We're talking about home ownership, car ownership, etc. Okay, $250,000 average. The average Black family in Greater Boston had eight, not 8,000, not 800,000, $8,
$8.
$8 of assets. So we're talking astronomical wealth gap, just
Right.
ridiculous. And if there's no generational wealth and families can't build throughout time, for their children and grandchildren and build that wealth up, so that those wealth gaps get worse over time because that generational wealth can never accrue.
It's just so interesting when we talk about this whole, I mean, and there's like so many, I can think of so many Black sayings just for that $8, right? So, Black people would say things like, well, you don't even, I'm so broke, I don't even have two nickels to rub together, right? To create a spark and a fire, to make heat. So it's so interesting. And I remember being in statistics class and seeing a chart much like this. And I remember my young white professor, pretty liberal guy, say, Tychelle, why do you look so sad right now? And I was like, well, you just told me I'm never going to have any money. I may die young, all of these things. And he was like, I didn't think about it like that. I was like, because you don't have to, right? So just even seeing that is like greatly depressing, I would say.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because when we're talking about this wealth redistribution, people really get scared when we're talking about taxing, the 1%. And most people think that they, are closer to the 1% than they actually are. But as it widens, and we talk about 2020 and 2021 having it widen even further, then we're missing some of these things, right? It's getting larger and not smaller, right? I remember seeing that chart that you showed, and it was more like $12 or $250, and seeing $8 is like wild.
Yeah.
It's just wild.
So Dr. King criticized capitalism. He criticized poverty. He criticized, um, he suggested that we need a guaranteed income because he understood that until we have this economic equality and material equality, we can't truly get rid of the system of racism in we can't move beyond it, right? We're never going to be able to erase the past, but we're never going to be able to move beyond it. And totally, that it's really depressing. And again, we're not suggesting there aren't wealthy Black people or poor white people. The story of these numbers is that this is a law of averages that tells a larger story of how things are kind of across the board. Not a rule for everybody, but it paints a larger picture, right? And Boston is a really wealthy community for wealthy white folks. Like there certainly are communities where rural poverty is a lot of white people and things like that. So please don't misunderstand us. We're not trying to say that all white people are rich or whatever.
I mean, certainly if we're talking about wealth redistribution, we should also be talking about 60, I think it's 64 or 66% of the people on welfare are white people. So
Right.
when we're talking about this, we're not talking about redistributing, taking money from white people and giving it to Black people. We're talking
Right.
about the 1% to the rest, to literally the rest of the 99%.
Right.
And I'm not even suggesting at this point socialism. I'm talking about redistributing wealth for what people have actually earned, right?
Right.
So when we're talking about that, we want to reallocate. And it's funny because I always tell people, like, when you think of they say there's an article that kind of amalgamates who welfare recipients are, called the welfare queen, and it talked about this one specific woman who was like cheating the system, and technically she was racially ambiguous because she might have been biracial, but they show her as a neck popping, gum snapping, rollers in her hair Black woman, and that's people's idea of what a welfare queen is, and thinking that all Black people who live in inner cities are on welfare. But 66% of the people on welfare are white, right? When we talk about redistribution of wealth, when we talk about white supremacy culture, that also talks about poor white people, because there are many, many poor white people. And when we're talking about white supremacy culture, it's going to leave out those folks as well, right? But what
Right.
it does is kind of stratify the wealthy one, white one, wealthy percent. There are like you said, there are rich black people, not as many as there are white. And it kind of says to them, you can be like me because we also have the same color of skin. But that's just a tactic so that you're not focused on the fact that you should be banding together to try and get wealth redistributed. I
Exactly.
wanted to at least say that because I think it's so interesting. We're not saying that there are no poor white people. There are many poor white people, many white people without health care, running water, who live in really rural, not just rural, but even in cities, but rural places, in cities, all kinds of places, and that leaves them out as well.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about wealth redistribution, when we reach to the people who are being most economically disadvantaged, and from like a chart like that shows, it's, it may be black people, but that should also lift up white people as well. So that's
Yeah.
I think that's I always want to say that, like, I'm not saying that we should give money to black people and not poor white people either, but we also have to address racism in that cause because it's tearing all poor people apart.
Well, and what that racism does is perpetuate this idea that poor white people have to compete with black folks for resources
Right.
instead of focusing on the wealthy, greedy people who have taken and siphoned off all of our money and not paid their fair share back into our society, right? So it misdirects
Yeah.
the problem. So
So one of the things I wanted to go back to too, when we're talking about specifically about Dr. King's message, um, we have to talk about his letters from a Birmingham jail and how he talked about white moderates. And I know we had a quote.
mm-hmm.
If you can pull that up.
Yeah, go for
Um,
it.
so it has been gravely, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. Hold on, let me, so I can see this a little bit better. The Negro's great stumbling block is his stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And this is from letters from a Birmingham jail.
Mm-hmm.
I could not agree more. I heard somebody recently on social media say that the reason that racism exists, and I'm not, this is what I heard, and it harkened me back to that quote. The reason that racism exists is nice white people, because they're not fighting hard enough because they're just happy to be in proximity to, be in relationship with, but they're not fighting against the system of racism, sexism, misogyny, things like that. And it just it was a 2021 version of that quote from letters from a Birmingham jail, which is a really interesting quote. And I think people leave out so many of the other things that he said, so many of his ideologies, to sanitize him and to sanitize people into not fighting hard or to not addressing racism head on. And it's one of the things that saddens me the most, and also frustrates me the most, as he said, because if you are my friend and you are silent, this is where we get allyship, but we also have to talk about performative allyship, and that you are kind of like, well, the people, I mean, they mean well, and my family, and it's like, no, but this is still a problem, right? When we're we're sanitizing his words, and the white moderate, which is who's in office right now, is a big problem, right? We're not doing as much as we could be doing. So I wanted to at least share that because that's one of the things that frustrates me very greatly.
Yeah, and going back to your analogy, the toothpick instead of the whole tree, shallow understanding from people of goodwill. So people who say they mean well, but are only willing to look at the toothpick. That's more frustrating and more disappointing to someone like Dr. King and to someone like you, Tychelle, than from someone who has malicious intent and refuses to understand.
Right, because I
It's
know where they stand.
right, right, and they don't pretend to support you and then give up when it gets a little bit uncomfy.
I love that saying, uncomfy. Yes,
Uncomfy,
right.
yeah.
It is exactly that.
And I
So,
heard this a lot during the Floyd riots, if I can jump
yeah,
into.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I've heard this a lot from white moderates and white conservatives. Oh, well, since, Black Lives Matter people allegedly burned down buildings, they lost their credibility, and we not supporting that cause anymore. They are, and then that got transmuted by conservative media into BLM is a terrorist organization, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But and my argument back was, even if they didn't burn buildings, you wouldn't be in support of this because it makes you uncomfortable. Even if this was and in this day and age, we have so much media sensationalist noise that it didn't even matter that 95% of these protests were totally peaceful. It didn't matter that millions of people around the country and the world marched for this. We still didn't get legislation that did a thing to address the problem that communities of color have been facing for 60 years
But they
and
painted
longer.
some streets. They painted some streets that
They
said
painted
Black
some
Lives.
streets. They renamed a square. Oh gosh, so there. And this is what I had a long conversation with a family member about this, because they kept going back to the fact, well, why are they looting and they looting and burning buildings? And I was like, what should disturb you more than the destruction of property is people losing hope. That's what you're seeing right now, is people losing hope.
Mm-hmm.
That
because
is
Martin Luther King said, riots are the language of the unheard.
Thank you. Segue. I'm going to be right back. My dog is like chewing a bone right behind my ear, and this conversation is too important.
No, so
I'm going to close the door. I'll be right back.
So I'll jump in, and one of the things that I think is really interesting here, one of the things, and we'll kind of transition into this, is this thought process that when the Civil Rights Act happened, racism ended. Right? I hear this so much on when we're talking about how people are emboldened to think that because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 happened, then racism must have ended at that point. Like that was it, as that story I was telling earlier. One last racist shot Martin Luther King, assassinated Martin Luther King, and racism ended. And one of the things that I hear on social media so much is these arguments that, because if you're on TikTok, you'll see people doing live debates, and one of the things that happens, they say, well, and I hear this a lot from folks, they'll say, well, there are no racist laws on the books right now. There aren't any laws that say Black people can't do this, Black people can't do that. And
it's actually not true. There are tons of racist laws still in the books, but right. To your greater point, please continue. There still are, yes.
Right. So, but what they are pointing to are things like the end of segregation. But when we talk about the end of segregation, we're talking about the end of segregation, what they say de jure, as in by court, by law, and not de facto. So that kind of leads into something like redlining. So redlining, Black people couldn't live in this area. This is how, if you live in a suburb, it was created specifically to keep out people of color. And redistricting. If you haven't, read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's a fantastic book that goes over redlining and properties, lines being drawn in so many different places. They talk about St. Louis, they talk about Philadelphia, they talk about Boston, he talks about so many different places, right? So we're talking there. No, you can't say that a Black person can't live here, right? You can't say that Black people can't live in a neighborhood, but how many neighborhoods are homogeneously white, and how many ghettos are homogeneously people of color, right? And they want to call them things like ethnic enclaves. I will say that whole de facto de jure, I have never been told I couldn't live anywhere, but I spoke to a man on the phone as I was apartment hunting years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago. And he was like, oh, sure, come by and see the property. I showed up. My husband, who is a white man, showed up, and he started to show him the property. And this is why people go, maybe it was just sold. And when I got out of the car after my husband, he was like, oh, you're together? Oh, okay. I mean, there was somebody here earlier who may be taking the place, and we were like ushered out. He didn't even want to show it to us. So yes, it's not on the books, and now I can't prove it, right?
Right.
So
it just shapeshifts. Like right. when slavery ended, it shaped, like this whole system shapeshifted into Jim Crow. When segregation ended, this whole system shapeshifted into redlining, and then mass incarceration, and now we have police brutality, and we have healthcare. It just shapeshifts. It just keeps moving around. It's like freaking whack-a-mole. Like you think you get one, and then another one just pops up somewhere else. It just
Man.
changes form, you
See,
know?
see, I know we're having like a serious discussion, but that kind of led me to a meme that I saw. I have to say it about how somehow this company convinced us to go eat pizza who at a place that is covered in filth and their mascot is a rat. Like, think
Oh,
about that. Chuck E. Cheese.
child casino with dirty pizza. Yeah.
Yes, child casino with dirty pizza and a mascot that's a rat, Charles E. Cheese.
Oh,
Anyhow, sorry. It is a
it's a weird
child
culture.
casino. Yeah, it's and I loved it.
I know.
But just
Yeah.
thinking back to a little bit, shifting back into this conversation about redlining, right?
Hmm.
I was actually talking to someone recently, and they were talking about living in a good neighborhood. And they were like, "Yeah, so I live in a good neighborhood. I used to live in like I grew up in a really good neighborhood, but now I live in a more mixed neighborhood. It's a little sketchy, a little shady." And I had to. I like,
You
the
said
power
something,
of
didn't
Christ
you?
compelled me. Of course, the power of Christ compelled me to say, and I said it nicely because it was a colleague, and I said, I just want to shift your language a little bit. When you say good, often we're using what we call coded language, and I had to use all my good college words, college inflection, not just the words. We're using coded language because when you say good, is the neighborhood you talking about mostly or predominantly white? And they looked at me, kind of looked around, and I was like, and when you say sketchy or mixed or whatever, are you talking about a predominantly black neighborhood, right? So then we started to talk about not just redlining, but then also other things that redlining does. I did shift their language, but we also started to talk about other things that redlining does. So when we talk about things like a food desert is a place that doesn't have a grocery store within, I think, 1 to 2 miles in walking distance,
Hmm.
right? Or public places for play, things like that, fresh foods, things like that. So I lived in, I actually did a project in grad school mapping my neighborhood as a food desert, because there wasn't a grocery store in walking distance for 10 years. And people who are often poor and impoverished don't always have grocery stores and don't often have cars. So then
Hmm.
that kind of leads into the other thing that you were talking about when we're talking about redlining. Then we have to talk about healthcare, because if you don't own a car and you can't get to fresh food and your neighborhood is littered with Chinese stores, and I'm not at all picking on Asian cuisine, but pizza stores, liquor stores, and things like that, then you're often eating at those places, and then you have hypertension, high blood pressure, all of these things. So
Not to
they're
mention the
leading.
cost of food is more expensive if you can't buy fresh groceries.
If you go to a corner store and try to buy one tomato, it's going to cost you $2.
Yeah,
Right, it's
exactly.
going to be so much more money, and it seems like a bargain because you're only getting that one tomato, and you're only spending $2 when you could get a whole, thing of tomatoes for $2, that kind of thing.
And then we have to talk about education because there's a ton of new studies coming out that talk about how malnutrition and high levels of stress for young children can cause developmental delays and low
Hmm.
test scores. And then we have to talk about the fact that
Wait.
our
But before you
education
go,
system,
so I'm gonna say,
go ahead,
I was gonna say, if we're talking about redlining, how property taxes fund schools,
property values fund schools. If you
and if you
live
live in
in
an
a,
impoverished neighborhood, then the schools in that neighborhood are also going to be low income,
not going to be as
right?
good. You're not going to get
So
a new iPad for your child. Yep.
So
Then
we
you're
have
going
to
to talk
talk
about
about
medicine.
all of these
Yep.
things that
This is
go
what we
into
mean.
one another. So,
Then, yep.
uh,
It's
so
so
I, go ahead.
the gaps are still present, alive and well today, and they are probably in every case that we just named worse than they were during Dr. King's day. And I think that's really important to remember. It's not that this stuff has like gotten mildly better and we're closer to progress. No, we are worse off in many ways than Dr. King was. Of course, yes, we have the Voting Rights Act. Of course, yes, you can't legally discriminate.
But do we with voting?
But do we? When we have people in black
We're not trying to
neighborhoods, I believe,
take away voting. Now you can't give
yeah,
food to people who are in line to vote.
you have people
You're
in
making it
black
harder.
neighborhoods in the South standing in line for 8 hours to vote. You still have functional voter discrimination. You have de facto voter discrimination, right? You have de facto medical discrimination. You have de facto banking discrimination. We have systems like credit that discriminate against people of color. So it's all of it. It's all of it. Dr. King was right. He's more right now than he was then.
And go read
And
all of his stuff if you're gonna talk. If you're gonna use any of the things that he says, you have to read all more into him than just "I have a dream." That was one speech. And one of the things that he said that I didn't pull a quote for is that he said that he one of his thoughts processes towards the end, toward closer to the end of his life, although he did not think it was the end of his life because he was assassinated, was that the way that he approached the movement could have been maybe he was integrating black people into a burning house, is a quote from Martin Luther King. In that integrate. And so one of the things I went to go see a play called Betty Shabazz versus the Nation off Broadway, and one of the parts of the play was Malcolm and Martin used to have these alleged secret meetings, and their ideologies were actually coming together a lot more after Malcolm's trip to Mecca. And he came back, he saw King's nonviolence, and then King saw his, way of being able to talk about different things in a more poignant way. So did he integrate people of color, black people, into a burning house? Was the end of segregation the best thing that ever happened to black people? And
he doubted himself. Wow.
Oh, absolutely.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And you can reach out to a lot of black activists who will say segregation didn't do much for us. I mean, the end of segregation didn't do much for us.
Yeah. But I want to make sure to go back to that. The right is the language of the unheard, and read the larger quote, because I think it's really important in this time. So, we're talking about communities who have had needs unmet for decades. And I actually watched interviews. I watched an interview during the Floyd riots or someone was videotaping 3 generations of people of color living in the same neighborhood saying, my generation fought for this, it didn't happen. His generation fought for this, it didn't happen. You need to keep fighting, but I know you want to give up, and I know it's really hard. But but it just really sank in, like, oh my God, these problems have been going on for so long, and white America has not been attentive. Yep. We've been aware, but we've not been attentive to these issues. But Dr. King, so he was asked if he would condemn riots, and this is really interesting. So he said, "It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention." And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. So when you see riots in the street, don't think about people misbehaving or being naughty. Think about people who are losing hope, who have no other way to get their voices heard. Think about people grieving publicly. Think about people trying to convey that they are desperate. It's desperation. It's not meanness. It's not vagrancy. It's not criminal behavior. It's desperation and it's grief. And I think when you can reframe that for yourself, I mean, as a white, I'm speaking mostly to white people, of course, right now. If we can reframe that and interpreting what these things mean, what these public displays mean, we'd be a lot more likely to get involved, because that's our neighbor who's in pain versus someone who needs to be quelled and stamped out and sit down and behave, right?
Well, and one of the things I would say too is not just your neighbor, right? Just because, and one of the things I say poignantly, and when I'm doing workshops, I call it the snow day scenario, right? If you've had a child and a school calls a snow day, and you look out your window and you don't see any snow, you're like, why do they call this snow day? This is ridiculous. But when a school calls a snow day, they have to call the snow day for the child who lives the farthest, who would have the hardest time getting to school.
Interesting.
And I use that scenario to say, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening to someone. And then just because you don't see it doesn't mean it won't happen to you next.
Yeah.
It may be coming your way. So when we really think about that, I think we have to think about it as white supremacy, racism. These things are hurting white people too. And not in a, you don't get to be best friends with a black person if you're racist sort of way, but like, no, like this is a distraction from you, from real problems that are actually happening. And I think it's really, and we really should be paying attention. So when we think, one of the things you said, you talked a little bit about Black Lives Matter before, and it made me think about when people say all lives matter, because I have had somebody literally write, I had a sign up that said Black Lives Matter, and somebody said all lives matter. If all lives matter was a real group and not just a figurehead of conversation, they would be the busiest
Yeah,
organization and group, because they would care for all people all the
they would.
time. They'd be at every march.
Yep.
If all lives matter, why aren't you out here with us?
Yeah.
That
Where's
kind of
your
thing.
logo?
Right. Where's your mission statement? Do something.
Where's your nonprofit status? Yeah.
So I just if you're going to quote Dr. King, quote all of him, read his ideologies. Otherwise, you
Yeah.
may be saying something that you don't actually agree with, or that you don't know enough about, and using one speech out of
And
all of the things that he said.
and you might actually be doing damage without even realizing it by misquoting him. So don't be a toothpick person.
Yeah, don't cherry pick. Take the
Don't
whole
cherry
tree.
pick. Take the whole
Take the
tree.
whole tree. Go sit under the shade. Um, so I wanted to make sure that we actually noted to you all about our schedule, and Mel will share a little bit about where we are, because we've been doing this, I think, now for 9 episodes.
9 episodes. Yep. This is our pilot season. We have one more episode coming your way next week, and then we're going to take a break till spring. We're both moving, so we need a little time, settle in. And, but we have
Don't move
really,
again, because it's not fun.
it's
Moving
not
is a
that
lot of
fun.
work, actually.
No. But we've really enjoyed this time with you all. Thank you so much for being with us and joining us. And please be in touch if you've got questions, episode ideas. If you do this kind of work, you want to be on the show, perhaps, possibly,
Yes,
we would love to talk to you. We just,
we
two
love
people
having
hanging
guests.
out.
Our guests had fun, I hope.
I hope
Yeah.
so. We wear comfy clothes. We hydrate, and we try to be good conversation partners.
So yes, we will be coming to you in the spring. But we do have one last episode, so we'll be around. And you can
Be
also
around.
always listen to our podcast, re-listen to some of the episodes if you didn't start listening in until the middle of the season.
Yep.
We are on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, I believe. All those
Twitter,
places. Twitter,
Google, something
Google,
else. We're a lot of
places.
places. We're
We
just
got we got a
blasting.
TikTok. We
We
don't we
do.
post a little bit, but we got a TikTok. Engage with us. So we wanted to
Yeah.
share that with you all, because we have one last episode before we the holidays are coming. All of them: Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Christmas. I almost forgot Christmas, and then the New Year's in this
Yeah.
holiday season. Have you started listening to Christmas music yet? Are you a Christmas music person?
This year, I don't know. I feel like it's been harder for me to get in the Christmas spirit this year for some reason. Last year, I feel like I needed the joy because of the panini, and I was like really having a rough time. And this year, I'm like, okay. We did get our tree already.
Is it
I
decorated?
It is
I
head to
was gonna say
toe.
it's not one of those
Yeah.
Charlie Bound trees where it's just sitting there with that one ornament.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's decorated, and my dogs keep trying to eat the ornaments of it. But I will say I was in Walmart the other day. I don't care to shop in Walmart very often, but they were playing really terrible Christmas music. Like I just had like a blaring headache after it, and I was like, Christmas music is a little bit overrated.
I will say, if you are usually listening to very what they call traditional, but I'm going to say white Christmas music, try your hand at on Pandora, A Soulful Christmas, because it
Ooh.
is doom 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 doom. It's good. It's great. I love it. That's the kind of Christmas music I listen to.
Nice.
I don't celebrate Christmas. I celebrate Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. And Hanukkah happened the weekend after Thanksgiving, and Kwanzaa happens the week after Christmas. I usually celebrate all of them. My mom celebrates Christmas, so I'm usually around, but we do more Hanukkah and Kwanzaa up in this piece.
And I celebrate winter solstice.
There you go, winter
Yeah.
solstice, and
Winter
the
solstice.
Festivus for the rest
Mhm.
of us. No, so celebrating and getting in the spirit and whatever the mood is, and New Year's and things like that.
Yeah.
So
It's going to be fun.
absolutely.
But yeah, one more episode next week is going to be about, I believe it's about decentering whiteness, which will be a good challenge for me because we haven't talked about that particular topic before, I think, Tychelle, and I'm really excited to talk to you about that.
Yeah, I mean,
So
it is, and I think I mean I run a book club called Decentering Whiteness, so we can
you
talk
do?
about that. Maybe I'll
You
bring
know
some of
all about
our
it.
what maybe we'll bring our producers on if they're around because they both are part of my book club,
That'd be awesome. Yeah, we should
and
do
some of
that.
the books we read. Yeah, we got to get you got to actually see their faces. But we've had so much fun with you, and we can't wait till next week. And
Yeah.
then planning for things in the spring. If you do want to be on the show, let us know. We want to bring in
Mm.
all people. I have so many guests that I want to bring on, and I also want to hear from you all because so many of you are all experts. Like one of my students who's in medical school was like, I listened to all 8, I think at that point it was like 7 or 8 episodes in the car the other day. I had
Yay!
somebody text me, a friend of ours, the one who brought us together as friends, text me and like sent me laughing emojis, and he was like, the story you told, and I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, I was listening to your podcast. I was like, well, you just text me randomly. It was like, the story I heard you say, you're so funny, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, bro. But you know, so if
This
you
has
want to
been a
be on the
blast.
show and you want to come have some good conversation with us and drink water and tea and
Hmm.
be here to that. So, and we'll be when we come back next week. We had an audience question that we really wanted to get to today, but our conversation went over, and we'll talk about it next week
I think
as we
that's a good idea.
decenter
Yeah.
whiteness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Any last words, Mel, before we end tonight?
I just want to thank you, Tychelle. I feel this like overwhelming gratitude for you and for your knowledge and your willingness to share from your experience and everything you are know, and the fact that you do this during the day for work, and then also you want to come off, after work and spend time with me still doing this work is
I was talking at work today and I was telling them, I was like, yeah, because I do a podcast. And they were like, oh, give it to me. I was like, not ready for that. I'm not ready for that yet. Maybe if we make it past this season or I stay at this job, maybe.
we're trying
And
not to be too scandalous with
we're not, but then people will be calling me, yeah, anyway.
but anyway,
It'll be
I'm
certain
thankful for
people.
you.
Thank you.
I'm thankful for you. You're just amazing, and your passion is awesome for this work, and you've taught me so much. So
I'm
much.
so happy to have a comrade, accomplice, partner in crime in this work. I'm gonna sign off on your good white person bill. No, I'm just
I don't
joking. I
use
can't do that. But
Thank you for the cookie.
to
Don't
be
eat
able
it, but I
to
appreciate it.
no, but to be able to engage with someone authentically and not feeling like I need to be someone else because so many people of color don't have that, right? They choose not to engage with white people because they don't feel like they get to do so authentically, learn from, joke with, all of those things. But we have to continue this Gus Fest next week
Oh,
as our
but
last episode is a part of that.
that is the biggest compliment you could have paid me, is that you could be yourself around me. That means a
Oh,
lot, and I'm glad.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Awesome.
Well,
Oh.
until next time, y'all, we will see you back next Tuesday at 8 EST,
Yep.
and we'll talk to you then.
Take it easy.
Bye.